So, you're trying to figure out how long a training block should be in powerlifting. Now, the length of a training block is going to vary from person to person. Now, there are mixed views on this, but is the block length actually arbitrary? And if it isn't, how do you even figure this one out? So in this video, I will tell you exactly how important it is, how to figure out the training block length, and if you wait to the end, I will show you an example of how I worked one out. So let's get into it. If you're new here, I am Norman Chung. I've been powerlifting coaching for over 10 years, and I've worked with 4 university powerlifting clubs and individual athletes to compete up to international level. So in order for us to understand how long programs or training blocks should last, we need to first understand the following. What we mean by program lengths, why program lengths are finite, what factors influence program lengths, the process of figuring out program lengths. Let's go back to what we mean by the length of a powerlifting program or a training block. First off, let's break down what we mean by block length or training program length. In powerlifting, programs are often structured around various time periods. In the immediate term, first, you have these individual training sessions, and a collection of these training sessions make up a microcycle or training week. And then a collection of microcycles make up a training block or a mesocycle. And in this video, this is what we're really referring to. And each mesocycle often has a beginning and an end, and they are commonly, but not always, marked by introduction weeks and deload weeks. And depending on your own programming philosophy, training weeks can be made up of the same stimulus that is repeated multiple times within a mesocycle, or different stimulus or stimuli that is commonly progressive across the block. So what happens at the end of a mesocycle? Well, sometimes we may repeat the mesocycle again, rep for rep, intensity for intensity, or a change in focus or strategy may actually happen. So when we revisit the question of how long should training blocks be, a better question to be asking is, how long should we continue to train before we end a block with a deload or transition? There are several concepts that we need to understand in order to figure out block length. The concepts that we will go through include overload and fatigue management, the fitness and fatigue model, and dose response. And also, we need to understand the influential variables that influence how block lengths can change over time as well. And we need to understand the process of figuring that one out, which we will go through if you wait till the end. So, going back to the concepts, we need to understand that we are constantly in a state of balancing overload and fatigue. The stimulus needs to create a sufficient overload that our body is stressed enough to create new strength gains from it, but not so much that we have excess fatigue that masks a lot of our performance, or worse, even get injured from too much fatigue. After a training session or a training week, there are 2 processes that happen to our physiology. There are biological processes that can mask our ability to perform. These are fatigue impacts. And there are things that can happen to increase our strength and adapt from it, and these are fitness impacts. And the sum of these impacts create a performance curve, and this is fundamentally the fitness and fatigue model. And depending on the size of the stimulus, you will get a different response in outcome of the performance after a set period. Now, doing too little or too much will bring about a reduction in performance through either undertraining or overtraining respectively, and somewhere in between is going to be a Goldilocks range where you can bring about optimal performance. And so we can refer to this as the maximal adaptive dose. Mapping out the relationship between the dose that we give a lifter and the response is going to be the dose response curve. So when it comes to monitoring performance from a week-to-week basis, it isn't enough just to look at the absolute weight that you or the lifter has lifted, i.e. whether it's just that you've squatted 200 kilos one week and 205 kilos the week after. So just by executing a heavier load doesn't necessarily tell us that the athlete is actually getting stronger. We have to be able to look at the movement of the top end maximal strength of every given session or week, which is why it's very common for most coaches these days to use an estimated 1 rep max. And then we map out the movement of this estimated 1 rep max. Once we can monitor the week-to-week performance, we can then see how performance is trending across a training block. And it is when we can see this top-end performance plateau or even trend downwards that puts us in a position of adaptive resistance, where we can no longer make a net positive adaptation from this stimulus. On this dose response curve, we are basically past this maximal adaptive dose or even maximal recoverable dose. And this may be when we need to deload or end the training block. Deloading or transitioning is going to be crucial. Deloading is a period where we reduce the training stimulus to allow your body to be able to recover, adapt, and prepare for more training ahead. Transitioning is more about changing the stimulus up to resensitize the athlete to previous training stimulus. Sometimes people call this a pivot block or pivot in training. Ultimately, deloading and transitioning will involve adjusting the training stimulus by manipulating a combination of volume, intensity, and exercise selection. Now, for the vast majority of the year, we want to be training at a level of difficulty where we are able to recover and create positive adaptations in performance. So, does the exact length of a training block matter? Well, this is actually a hard question to answer because it matters to a certain extent, but it's more like a dependent variable as opposed to an independent variable that we would actively change. So what this means is that the length of a block is an element of a program that depends on other training variables such as the difficulty of your training week. And the optimal block length is found from seeing other training variables and aspects of the program play out. And it is somewhat important, but that doesn't mean that there isn't just a fixed singular option. As there is an indefinite combinations of training variables, there is likely going to be a range of viable possibilities of block lengths. But depending on how you are going to string a training program together, there are probably going to be about 1 to 2 ideal options suitable for the way that you are deciding to progress the training weeks. Ultimately, block length matters as you want to be able to time it right, especially when it comes to prepping a lifter for a competition. At the end of the day, you ultimately want to be able to manipulate the block length of a competition peaking block, or potentially even the prior training block, so that you can time your block right so that your performance shows up on that competition day. So ultimately, what matters is timing a block length in accordance to when you peak in your progress within a training block. So what factors influence block length, or when we need to end a training block? The first one is going to be the experience level of the athlete. So your stage in your powerlifting journey, whether you are a beginner, intermediate, or advanced, significantly influences your program length. Beginners adapt quickly from the novice effect and may be able to run much longer cycles and not deload as often, while advanced lifters may benefit from slightly shorter stretches of training before deloading, relatively speaking. The next one is going to be whether you use a progressive stimuli or a static stimuli. Now, if you have a progressive strategy in a training block where you implement a continued progression in the stimulus, then there is a small chance that you are likely to develop slightly shorter mesocycles. Now, if you have a constant repeated bout of a training difficulty, you may find yourself being able to develop longer exposures to that repeated microcycle before you hit a brick wall and you need to end the mesocycle. If you are going to run a training block made from a repeated microcycle, you are more likely to be managing a size of a stimuli so that you can make positive progress for a long enough time. You probably don't want that static microcycle to be so hard that you need to deload after 2 weeks of it. And because ultimately you're going to create a lot of volatility in training performance, and it's going to be hard to monitor whether there's an upward trend in training, especially if you are going to slap on top of that the general noise of fluctuations in day-to-day live externals. Ultimately, the harder the training weeks or microcycle, the more frequently you're going to need to deload. On the other hand, if you are training with a progressive approach to training weeks, where there is a progression in the stimulus from 1 week to another, you may find yourself needing to deload sooner depending on how you start that training block. If you are going to have a bit more of a static start initially at the beginning of a block, where the training is relatively easier in nature to assess the tolerance of the lifter, before you add intensity progression, you may find that the block length will increase as a consequence. Now, one huge influential factor is going to be the magnitude of that stimulus of that training week. And what I mean is how stressful that training is. Now, the stressfulness isn't just dependent on whether it's been exposed to higher intensities per se, but it could be dependent on having higher volumes as well. So if training sessions and weeks are generally harder in nature, you may find yourself peaking in performance earlier on in the training block before crashing down and needing to deload. However, if you start off with the training weeks a little bit more conservatively, you may find your training blocks last a little bit longer before needing to deload. In my own personal experience, I've had lifters where in the past we've had training blocks that have lasted from about 10 to 12 weeks with continual progress in performance. I have also had lifters where we have trained for about 3 weeks before needing to deload. The next factor is going to be life and externals. Outside of training, our life and externals massively influence what we can recover from and what we can create adaptations from. Let's say you made good progress from a training block over a few weeks. And if you were to redo the program again, but this time, your external stressors were much higher than usual, let's say due to multiple factors outside of training, and your capacity to recover and adapt is reduced. This may well potentially decrease your block duration before needing to deload. The alternative can be true too. If your external stressors suddenly reduce and your training became a relatively larger stressor relative to the rest of your life, then it's possible that you can probably drag out the training stimulus for a longer period before needing to deload. The problem with deloading too early is that if you suddenly drop the stimulus off, depending on how much you actually deload, you may take away that positive momentum of progress. And the final and most important factor is going to be your competition calendar. This is going to be your hard constraint on your block length, especially for your final competition prep training block. peaking into the competition. Now, this is going to depend on how different your peak and tapers are relative to your regular training blocks. Generally speaking, you can use your time to peak performance in a training block to be able to design the length of your peak and taper so that you end up peaking right when you are on your competition day. By using that known quantity, you can then time and work backwards in your training blocks from your competition day. So what's the process of finding out how long you should train before deloading? Now let's get into why the answer is actually so nuanced. So the first things first, the best place to get clues to how long training blocks should be is to look at previous training blocks. If the nature of training weeks are relatively similar in overall volume and average intensity, then the chances are that the length of the training blocks may not necessarily deviate too much. If it seems like the case that they may be hitting the ceiling in the last week or two or even crash, then you may want to consider cutting the block length by 1 or 2 weeks before actually deloading. However, if this means that the block length ends up being either 3 or less weeks, it may be a better option to adjust the training variables instead of reducing the training block length. Because ultimately, if training blocks are really short in nature, you're going to get a very volatile movement of top-end performance, and this could make long-term progress hard to monitor. So if you're looking to design an off-season or development block or strength block, whatever you want to call it, if it's a static microcycle that's repeated, look at when you get 2 weeks of back-to-back plateaus or drops in performance after that visible upward trend. So when you see this sign along with other markers of fatigue, then you want to deload. Then you want to run the block again and deload before you're expected to crash according to the previous block. If you choose to use a progression through the training blocks, look to see when the performance starts to level off or plateau or drops by a week. Then deload. Then when you run the training block again, deload at the week where the lifter is due to crash. However, there are sometimes situations where you may not necessarily just want to cut off the training block before the peak performance drops. Sometimes there are situations whereby the lifter needs to have that exposure to that certain level of training intensity or difficulty that is inherently fatiguing. And you may have a reason for having this lifter be exposed to this. Generally speaking, we do want to optimize for positive progress long term, but that isn't the be all and end all of good training in some situations. If you are looking to decide a block length for a competition block, a key thing that you want to optimize for is timing the performance to peak on that competition day. Now, you can use the observations of performance from previous training blocks to time when it coincides with peak performance within that competition day. If you tend to have a peak performance on a training block by the final week of the block, by peak performance I mean estimated 1 max, then you may want to peak and taper for the same length of the block or 1 week less. If you tend to have a peak performance on the penultimate week of the training block, you may want to consider using a block length or 1 to 2 weeks shorter than your regular training block, and without changing the training variables too much. Because fundamentally what we are trying to do is to rely on the predictability of this. So here's a worked out example. Here we have Gurnarm. Gurnarm uses 5-week training blocks. In the off-season, we often use a more proactive deload as opposed to a reactive deload, because as an athlete, he often enjoys training with this exposure of a higher level of intensity. And his peak performance is often during the 3rd to 4th week of a training block. And as he is a relatively consistent lifter, we were able to get a good string of data to help us predict when his peak performance is. So in the end, we decided to adopt a 3-week peaking block as opposed to a 4-week peak. This is because in case his peak performance ends up being on the 3rd week as opposed to his 4th week might actually potentially be too fatigued, leading to suboptimal performance on competition day. So leading up to his last competition, we ended up hitting sets of 225, 140 and 265, and on a competition day we managed to hit 230, 150 and 280 with ease. So I hope you guys found it useful, and if you did find it useful, make sure you click like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next one.